Bring in now Congressman Krishnamoorthi. He's a Democrat from Illinois and a member of the House Intelligence and Oversight Committee. So good to see you.
Good morning, Frederica.
So let's begin with Russia and listen to what President Biden said.
And I know him relatively well. And the conversation started off, I said, I know you and you know me. If I establish this occurred, then be prepared.
So you know Vladimir Putin. You think he's a killer?
Mm-hmm. I do.
So what price must he pay?
The price he's going to pay, well, you'll see shortly.
So these comments prompted Russia to recall its ambassador from Washington for the first time in 20 years. So what do you make of that?
Well, I think that sometimes you have to dispense with diplomatic niceties, and I think that Biden called a spade a spade. In this case, it's clear that Vladimir Putin murdered people such as Alexander Litvinenko, who was a dissident, poisoned to death in Britain. He attempted to assassinate or poison Alexei Navalny. And so this type of behavior is completely acceptable outside the international rules-based norm of how we should conduct ourselves. And I think that Joe Biden did the right thing.
So ultimately, do you see that Biden's approach with Putin might be more effective in keeping Russia in check? Will it stop Russia's interference in U.S. affairs?
Yes, I think that when Donald Trump, basically called the Russian interference in 2016 a hoax, and then we learned through declassified documents as well as classified documents that essentially the Russians did engage in a systematic interference in not only the 2016 but the 2020 elections, and Joe Biden is going to stand up to the Russians on this count because the hoax was not a hoax. Then the Russians will learn that they can't just interfere in our elections, conduct themselves in ways that are completely intolerable to other countries, and to conduct these gross violations of human rights on the scale that they have. And so we have to stand up against them.
Do you decipher anything ominous from Putin when he wishes upon President Biden, good health after Biden, said in that interview, described him as a killer?
I don't know. I think that right now Joe Biden has to present a very united front with our partners and allies against Russia's interference in our collective democracies. This recent declassified report shows that once again in the 2020 elections, the Russians tried to promote Donald Trump and denigrate Joe Biden through intermediaries. Thankfully, the report does say that they were unsuccessful in tampering with our election infrastructure and votes. But nonetheless, we do need to make them pay a cost for what happened in 2020 as well.
Turning to China now, was taking such a vocal stance on China, at those talks, the right thing for Secretary of State Blinken to do?
Well, I think both the weather and the talks were frosty in Alaska for good reason, because, basically the Chinese government, again, has conducted gross violations of human rights against the Uyghurs and in Xinjiang. They've engaged in a crackdown in democracy in Hong Kong, engaged in aggression against their neighbors, including folks like Taiwan, as well as India for that matter. And they're engaging in widespread industrial espionage, cyber attacks, and theft of intellectual property against Americans. And so, yes, the Americans have to, Joe Biden and Tony Blinken acting on his behalf have to speak up and be very firm about what we would like to see changed in the Chinese government's approach and their relationship with us and others.
And how do you think the U.S. should proceed with handling China?
Well, I think that on the one hand, we have to be candid about our differences and figure out how do we resolve them, and we have to keep in place, for instance, tariffs on certain Chinese goods, especially where those goods are meant to drive out competition among American companies. But on the other hand, there are places where we can cooperate, whether it's with regard to Afghanistan or man-made climate change or other issues. So we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. I'm confident that Joe Biden can do that.
And then I do want to ask you about this week's horrible shootings. You're a member of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, and you've been hearing the stories.
Yes,
and witnessed, the racism that is taking place against Asian Americans across this country. Where do we go from here? What do you see the road ahead to look like?
Well, I think in the immediate term, the killer has to be brought to justice, and I think that it was a hate crime. I don't think that, as some people were saying, he was merely, quote-unquote, having a bad day or combating a sex addiction. You have to understand that Asian Americans only comprise like 4% of the population in the Atlanta area. He knew what he was doing by going after these particular people, and it was because they were of Asian descent. The second thing is, in the medium and long term, we have to pass legislation such as my own bipartisan hate crimes commission bill to finally study at the federal government level the rise of hate crimes toward various minorities, including Asian Americans, and what do we do to combat it. And then long term, we have to educate people about the long history of discrimination toward Asian Americans in this country, starting with the Chinese Exclusion Act from 100 years ago to the Japanese American internment in World War II, toward attacks against Muslims and South Asian Americans in recent years. And so these are the types of actions that need to be taken, Frederica.
Congressman Krishnamoorthi, always good to see you. Thank you so much. Be well.
Thank you, Frederica. You too.